It is a Tuesday evening in San Francisco, 1974. A woman named Linda, 23 years old, recently divorced, recently fired, walks into a rented church hall on Gary Street because a flyer promised free dinner and community. The room smells of candle wax and reheated soup. Someone takes her coat before she can ask them to. Someone else hands her a bowl, warm between her palms, and looks at her, directly, unhurriedly, and says, "We're really glad you came." No one has said that to her in months. By the end of the night, a man at the front of the room has spoken for 2 hours. Linda cannot remember most of what he said, but she remembers the feeling. She felt chosen, significant, as though her particular grief had been anticipated, as though this particular room had been waiting, specifically, for her. She comes back Thursday. She comes back the following Tuesday. 6 months later, she has given the organization her savings account number. She is not stupid. She is not broken. She is, by every clinical measure, psychologically normal. That is exactly what makes this terrifying. Here is what doesn't make sense. Linda is educated. She taught elementary school. She reads. She called her mother every Sunday before the calls became complicated, before the organization began referring to family as the old life. She knew, on some rational level, that something was shifting. She felt the pull of it and moved toward it anyway, like a moth that understands, abstractly, what light does to wings. She is not an anomaly. She is the rule. Robert Lifton, a psychiatrist who spent decades interviewing survivors of thought reform programs or cults in more direct terms, noticed something disquieting in his patient files. The people most susceptible to ideological capture were not the desperate or the delusional. They were the searching, the thoughtful, the ones who wanted, genuinely, to become better, which is most of us, which is almost all of us, at certain latitudes of our lives. In the late 1970s, a social psychologist named Margaret Singer began doing something unusual. She started sitting across from cult survivors, not treating them, not diagnosing them, just listening, hundreds of them, over decades. She kept a yellow legal pad. She tracked patterns the way a naturalist tracks migration. Singer noticed that every recruitment story, regardless of the organization, moved through the same architecture. She called her colleagues. She went back and reviewed Lifton's interviews. She pulled transcripts from Jonestown, from the Unification Church, from groups with no names at all, just charismatic men in rural properties with enlisted addresses. The architecture was always the same. First, identify the wound, not dramatically, conversationally. A leader, or a recruiter, would simply ask questions, the kind of attentive and hurried questions that most people's lives contain no room for. What do you feel is missing? What were you hoping for that didn't happen? The recruit would speak, often for the first time, about things they had not said aloud, and they would feel, in the speaking, a specific kind of relief, then offer the explanation. Singer documented this phase across every group she studied. The leader presents a framework, spiritual, political, nutritional, it hardly matters, that makes the recruit's suffering make sense, not just bearable, meaningful. The wound had a reason. The reason is this doctrine. The doctrine is, not coincidentally, in the leader's possession. Then, love bomb. The term was coined inside the movement. It means what it sounds like: sustained, orchestrated warmth, eye contact, physical touch, the specific attention of being seen by a group. Singer's notes describe recruits weeping at this phase, sometimes without understanding why. Then, only then, comes the isolation. Singer published her findings across multiple papers and eventually a book. What she had mapped was not manipulation in the crude sense. It was something more precise: the systematic exploitation of attachment. Neuroscientist and trauma researcher Patrick Carnes later showed that the brain responds to this sequence in ways that are nearly indistinguishable from falling in love. The same dopamine circuits, the same oxytocin bonding, the same neurological fusion of this person with safety. When the safety is then made conditional, contingent on belief, on obedience, on financial contribution, the brain doesn't process it as coercion. It processes it as the cost of love. And humans, neurologically, will pay almost any cost rather than lose love. Singer's most unsettling finding was about exit. The reason people cannot simply leave, she documented, is not stupidity or weakness. It is that leaving requires dismantling the only framework that made their pain meaningful. To leave is to return to the wound without the explanation. Most people choose the explanation. The hall in Gary Street is gone. Jim Jones is dead. But the architecture Singer mapped is not historical. It has migrated. It lives in the recruitment flows of certain multi-level marketing companies, which open with "I saw something in you" and close with "your old friends don't understand where you're going." It lives in certain political movements that identify the wound, economic anxiety, cultural displacement, and offer an explanation with a villain attached, and then surround the convert with a community so warm, so certain, that leaving means losing both the meaning and the people. It lives on social media platforms algorithmically engineered to move users through stages Singer would recognize: identification of grievance, provision of framework, community of the similarly converted, escalating investment of identity. It lives, in subtler forms, in certain relationships, the partner who, in the beginning, asked the kind of questions no one had ever asked, who made the wow and feel finally understood, who later made the love conditional on behavior the person, alone, would never have agreed to. The scale changes, the mechanism doesn't. Linda eventually left. It took 4 years, a sister who drove 11 hours, and the particular luck of a group that hadn't moved to a compound yet. In her interview with Singer, she said something that the researcher underlined: "I knew what was happening to me. I could see it from some part of my mind, but that part of my mind was very far away, and the part of my mind that was warm and known and mattered, that part was right there." This is the realization, not that cults exist, not that charismatic leaders are dangerous, not even that ordinary people can be recruited. The realization is this: the part of you that is rational, skeptical, defended, that part can watch the other part be taken. It can observe in real time. It can name what is happening and still be powerless, because the need to belong is not a character flaw. It is not a failure of intelligence. It is the oldest wiring in the human brain, older than language, older than reason, the deep animal imperative that says, do not be alone in the dark. And some people have learned, with extraordinary precision, how to be the light. This is based on the documented research of Dr. Margaret Singer, Dr. Robert Lifton, and the survivor testimonies cataloged in Cults in Our Midst 1995. The mind is stranger than most people realize. Subscribe if you'd like to keep exploring it with us.